your screen.
Okay, perfect. So thanks for joining, everyone. I appreciate you spending some time today with me. So today we're going to cover a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, availability groups, and the ability to deploy them very easily on Azure VMs now. Directly from the portal. If you don't know who I am, my name's Taryn Pratt. I am a senior program manager at Microsoft. I work on the SQL Server on Azure VM team. I've been on the team for about a year now. My focus on the team is business continuity. So that encompasses, obviously, high availability, disaster recovery. I manage and I handle all of the backup needs for customers on SQL VM, as well as started working on patching options for customers on Azure VM as well. Prior to working at Microsoft, I was a DBA, DBRE for, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so, including being the DBA at Stack Overflow, where I tried not to cause too many outages for everybody that likes to use the site. I am a former data platform MVP. And my favorite thing to do in SQL Server is actually use a pivot. So pivot all the things. I know everybody loves the thing from Friends with the pivot. That's me. You can find me on Twitter, or I guess you could call it X now, at Taryn Pivots. I have a blog, which is very out of date, but TarynPivots.com. I've got some old stuff in there of some of the migrations and things like that that I did at Stack Overflow. And my pronouns are she, her. And you probably, if you follow me on Twitter, you probably recognize the blue-footed booby because, you know, they're the best and they're super cute. So had to put that here. Okay, so our agenda today is pretty short. I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the different availability group options on Azure VM because we have a lot of them. Then I'll cover the deployment option that we have from inside of the Azure portal. I'm going to have a little demo, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A to hopefully answer any of the questions that you may have about this. Okay, so if you have ever attempted to deploy an availability group on an Azure VM, you probably know that there's a lot of options in order to do that. We support various configurations for an availability group. Some of the options that we have are single subnets. So you'd have multiple SQL servers in a single subnet using a load balancer for the listener. We've got a single subnet, again, with a distributed network name for the listener. And then lastly, we've got multiple subnets. So separate subnets for each VM in a multi-subnet configuration. Every single one of these options is completely supported by us, and some of them are definitely far easier to set up than others. And our goal is to try and make them as easy as possible for every customer, depending on what their needs are. So first up is the single subnet with a load balancer. So this was the first option that most people used. And basically what it is you've got multiple VMs. Each one of them is in a single subnet. So you've got your virtual network, you set up your subnet, and every single SQL Server VM that you're going to set up goes into that single subnet. In order to do this one, because of the way Azure works, there's a floating IP that moves around in Azure. You have to have an internal load balancer to hold the IP addresses for the listener. So it holds the IP address for the cluster. It also holds the IP address for the listener. And you've got what is called a virtual network name as the listener. The problem with this implementation is it's slow when you go to failover. So the load balancer is great, except it adds an additional 10 seconds or so for failover. Now, as someone who's a DBA, when you've got to fail over, you want it to go fast. So having additional latency because of some sort of infrastructure that you need isn't necessarily the best thing for you, especially if it's in an emergency that you're attempting to fail over. So it's not necessarily the most ideal. However, many customers still need to use a load balancer. And additionally, if you've ever gone through the process of setting up an Azure load balancer to use it as the listener, it gets really complicated really quickly. And if you don't set it up right, it's not going to work. So that's the first option. The next option that we have is the single subnet with a DNN listener. Again, it's fully supported. We implemented this to kind of avoid the need of having to use a load balancer and use a distributed network name for the AG listener. But again, there's some caveats and some drawbacks to it. There's a lot of limitations using a DNN listener. It only works with certain versions of SQL Server, obviously the more recent ones. So you've got 2019 CU 8 and later, 2017 CU 25 and later, 2016 SP3 and later, and Windows Server 2016 and 2016 and later. And additionally, there's problems because the DNN, that listener, the port has to be unique. So you can't use like a same port across that's been shared by anything else. So that's another issue that many customers have is they maybe assign a port to it and it's already being used by something else. You have to be certain that whatever port you're using for a DNN listener isn't being used by anything else, and it can't be 1433, which is the standard port for SQL Server. So there's a lot of complexity with the DNN listener as well, which is another reason why it's not one of our preferred methods for customers to utilize because there are so many caveats to implementing it. The last option that we have is the multi-subnet configuration. So this is our preferred setup that we advise customers to do this because this is so very similar to what a lot of people already have on-prem. You've got a separate subnet for each VM. And it works on every single version of SQL Server as well as Windows Server. So there's no limitations there. The only problem and complexity in using this is the connection string for any of your application has to have that multi-subnet failover equals to true. For a lot of legacy applications and things like that, or even a DBA setting this up, you might not have the ability to make those connection string changes, which is why this might not be an option for you. And that's also a reason why we still support all of those other options, because we have to consider that not everyone can make these changes, especially initially. Like if you've got a vendor application and maybe you can't make those changes to the connection string, or you're working at a different deployment cycle as, maybe the app team, you might not be able to do it. But the plus with the multi-subnet is you do not need a load balancer. So the failover latency is significantly better in a multi-subnet solution because you don't have the load balancer adding that latency to it. So the setup, basically, you're going to have, multiple VMs. You've got one in each subnet. You've got a cluster IP and a listener IP, depending on what version of Windows Server you're using. And then you have a cloud witness, and in between you've got your DCVM. So you've got your domain controller that's got all of your domain information. So just a real brief overview of all of the options that we have, just so that you can, like, if you ever wanted to reference this, it's pretty quick. This is also available on a blog that we released back in 2021 when we first announced the multi-subnet, or the multi-subnet. So basically, this is our preferred method, is using a multi-subnet configuration. It's simple and easy. There's no limitations. There's no failover latency. The single subnet, you've got either a DNN AG listener, or you've got to use a load balancer. They each have their pluses and minuses with them, and so we as I said, we do support all of them. It's really based off of what your needs are. So what we've attempted to do is we've attempted to try and make it easier for customers to deploy the multi-subnet configuration, because we feel that that's the easiest, since it is so very similar to an on-premises type of solution.
Hey, Taryn,
Yeah.
there is one question.
Sure.
Tayyip is asking, no load balancer. How about one in on-prem and one in Azure data center?
So yeah, that's still very much supported. It's 100% a supported solution for this. I'm not touching on that in this presentation because this is solely for infrastructure that's in Azure. But if you have an on-premises and you want to see, so is the question that you want to know whether or not you still need a load balancer? You probably would still need a load balancer if you were going from on-prem, like if you added a replica to like on-prem and you expanded it to Azure. I don't know how easily it would be and how easy that failover would be if you didn't have a load balancer. I don't think we have any docs outlining how to set that up at this point. It's on my list of things to document, which means that I would fully test it as well. So Taya, feel free to send me an email and I can follow up with you on that because I can't answer 100% with 100% certainty as to whether or not you need to have a load balancer for that.
Okay.
Any other questions right now?
No.
Okay,
Not so far.
cool.
Thanks.
All right. So as we were approaching this automated experience that we have set up, prior to November 2022, we actually had a deployment experience that was already within the portal. So if you went to a SQL Server VM and from the portal, there was an option that says like availability. From within the portal, you were able to deploy an availability group with a load balancer to existing infrastructure. So that experience would allow you to, as long as you had basically your SQL servers in place and stuff like that, we would go ahead and we would automatically create the availability group as well as the load balancer and kind of take away some of that pain for customers, because the load balancer, as I mentioned, it's kind of complicated. If you go through the docs to set it up manually, it's kind of a pain. I'm just going to be honest. But that experience, we learned very quickly, was really painful for customers. So it never moved beyond public preview because we found out very quickly that deploying to existing infrastructure for customers was really hard. We weren't aware of firewall rules and whether or not they had permissions, and all of the ins and outs of the existing hardware made it really hard for us to set it up successfully for customers to then go ahead and go off and just start using their AG as they needed. It created a lot of support cases. So that's part of the reason why we pulled that out, and we no longer have right now any kind of experience that deploys to existing infrastructure. It was replaced in November of 2022 with our new experience, which deploys a multi-subnet experience or multi-subnet configuration for customers. So during PASS, we announced that this was going to be available for public preview. It's still in public preview today. We are slowly moving towards getting to GA. We've made incremental improvements on it since we announced it. But from the portal, what you can do is you can set up 9 SQL Server virtual machines, a Windows Server failover cluster, availability group, and a listener, all in a single deployment. And it's all in a single region, which is something that we do want to expand out to give more DR for customers with it. But again, there's a lot of complexity in going cross region. So right now, it's all in a single region. It supports SQL Server 2016 and later and Windows Server 2016 and later. It makes it so much easier for customers to be able to go to the portal, kind of give us all the information that they need or that they want, and then we go ahead and we kick off a deployment. It takes a little while, especially if you've got 9 VMs that are being spun up, but it does do all of the major legwork for customers without having to sit and manually set up all of this stuff. All right, let me go ahead. The one thing with the multi-subnet, this is the one caveat that we do have with it. There are a lot of prerequisites. We've outlined and we've documented it pretty much everywhere. And you'll see when we go through the experience, we've actually created a PowerShell script for you to go out and be able to validate that everything is correct before you go ahead and you kick off any kind of deployment. But there are some prerequisites, because while we can set up the SQL VM, we also want to make sure that all the underlying mechanisms are set up correctly for you. So obviously you need a resource group. That's pretty much a given. You need a virtual network, as well as a custom DNS server with the IP address configured, because it allows us to be able to kind of grab IP addresses from that DNS server. A domain controller in the same virtual network. And then the key thing is that you have to have the accounts that you're using as you're going through the workflow, they have to have certain permissions that's required. It's the same kind of permissions that you would have if you were manually setting it up. You have to have a domain user account with create computer object permissions. This is the account that's going to create your Windows Server failover cluster as well as the AG and does the installation of SQL Server. And lastly, you've got to have a domain SQL Server account, whatever it is that you typically use. Most companies have both of these available when they're going through and they're setting up their infrastructure. That's what you need for this in order to make sure that everything is ready to go. Any questions so far before I jump into a demo? Okay.
No, not so far.
Okay. All right. Let me switch screens. Okay. I hope you can see my screen again. All right. So the deployment experience, there's a couple ways that you can actually access this experience. And if you've gone through the creation flow process for a single SQL Server VM, you'll notice that this is very, very similar to that. We try to, they're different because they have different, obviously different flows for them, but we tried to make them as similar as possible. And we tried to actually consolidate things to make it a little bit more user-friendly for customers as they're going through the experience. So there's a couple of ways that you can access creating this type of, or accessing this deployment experience. So the first way is, the standard, you go to the marketplace, you create resource. This is the problem with live demos, but this was the easiest way for me to do this. So SQL Server, I'm just going to put in SQL Server HA because I'm looking for high availability. We have a new tile in the marketplace. If I can find it, it's right here, the SQL Server with high availability. This is one entry point into it, which allows you to kind of get into our workflow. The second entry point to this is if you come home, and I have it on my screen because I'm always on this screen. So if I go to SQL Virtual Machines and I just create a new SQL Virtual Machine, there is an option right here. Let me actually make this a little bit bigger. There's an option right here on the SQL virtual machines. You just click HA, the high availability. You select your image that you want. I'm going to go with an older image just because it'll show a slight change in the workflow. And then you go ahead and you hit create, and it's going to take you right into the experience. I started going through this earlier to kind of make things a little bit easier for the demo purposes. But as you'll see when we're walking through this, that this is very similar to the single SQL Server create experience. So well, we have all basically the same tabs. You select your subscription, your resource group. As I mentioned, you can pick up to 9 VMs. So we've got a little slider here. You can go up to 9 VMs. As you're doing this, it creates new VM names, which we just defaulted them to my VM, and then you can edit it to whatever name that you want. I know everybody's organization has their naming conventions. I'm going to just stick with my VM1 and my VM2 on this. You select your region, and then whether or not you want an availability zone or availability set. We default to availability zone because it gives you better DR. Because then you've got different machines in different zones. When we're going through this and you do select availability zone, what we do, like if I had 3 VMs on here, I'll just go ahead and I'll change this to 3. We round robin. So obviously every availability zone has multiple zones. So we round robin the availability zones, but we do offer the ability for you to, if you needed to, assign each VM to a specific zone. Some companies require that, so we implemented that so that you can do that, and I'll show you where you would make that change. You select your image, which is pre-selected from my previous page where I picked, SQL Server 2017, Windows Server 2019, the VM size that you want. Now, the thing to remember when you're deploying this, since we're deploying multiples, every single server and every single VM that's being deployed, they're all going to be identical. So if you pick one size, they're all going to be the same. Every single setting that you put in here is going to be the same across all your SQL Server settings. Everything will be identical across every single VM that's being deployed. Obviously, your virtual machine account name, which is the local machine name. We consolidated the licensing on the basics tab. So you've got your Windows licensing that we have here. You can confirm whether or not you've got software assurance. And then we even put the SQL Server licensing just because it's easier instead of having Windows licensing on one page and then on the SQL Server tab, you've got the SQL Server licensing. We feel like it makes more sense to have it in one place. So we consolidated it for this. The next tab that we go through is your networking tab. So you select your virtual network, which, as I mentioned, you've got to have a virtual network that's in your and single subnets for this, or separate subnets for each one. So I selected my virtual network earlier. You pick all this, the normal options. You've got your NIC settings, your whatever ports you want. What if you need a public IP, what SKU you're using. The thing that's different with this, which is where some of the multi-subnet comes in, is on the networking tab. What we've done is each, as I mentioned, and this is the crux of the multi-subnet, each VM has to have its own subnet. So in your virtual network, if you've already created your subnets, they will already be pre-populated based off of the virtual network that I selected above. If you don't have your subnets created, you can go ahead and you can create your subnets directly from the experience. I already had mine in here, so I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to select, all of the subnets that I want. I'll pick this one. I'll pick this one because I need 3 since I now have 3 machines. And I'll pick that one. What we do with this is we try to make it smart enough to go out and pre-populate your listener IP. And if I had selected Windows Server 2016, I would also have a cluster IP that's listed here. We go out and we say, okay, we know that those IPs are not being selected from that and not being used from that virtual network. And from that subnet, so we pre-populate it. You are able to come in here and you are able to change this if I wanted to. So these listener IPs are all different. So if I wanted them all to be the same, I could change them, and I'm just changing basically the subnet. Oh, see, that's not there. So I have to make a change and I'm going to put it back because, live demos are terrible. And then, as I mentioned, here's where we've allowed you to go ahead and adjust the availability zones. So if you really wanted to, you could change this, but this is what we pre-selected for your availability zones and where all your VMs are going to go. But you can make changes as needed based off of your organization. I'll go ahead and I will say I want to delete the public IP and the NIC. Then we start getting into some of the setup for the Windows Server failover cluster. As I mentioned, any of the accounts that you're using in this, they have to have the correct permissions. You've got to have create computer object permissions. If you don't have that, your deployment is going to fail. It's critical that you have that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it a cluster name. I'll just use test cluster. My storage account, I've already pre-selected that. Then you put in your Active Directory domain details. So this is the account that needs to have the create computer objects permission. As well as the password, and then whatever your domain name is that you have in DNS. And then additionally,
Taryn, there
yeah,
is
go ahead.
one question around
Yeah,
this, that can you use GMSA?
you will be
Group
able to.
management.
You will be able to. We don't have it set up yet. It's something that we are planning for the GA release. So that's going to be coming for the SQL Server. So for SQL Server, you will have an option to either use the same domain join account, a custom, or a GMSA. So that is coming. I can't tell you exactly when, but it is definitely, it's on the roadmap for GA. So it will be coming soon. Any other questions?
No, not so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. So once you've gone through and you've, set up all of your accounts and details and things like that, obviously you just go to your next setting. So this is the disks. This is for your VM. This is whatever it is that you need for your VM. But then we also consolidated and we moved the SQL storage onto the disks because it makes more sense that it's all combined. So this is the storage configuration. This is the standard pane that you get for a normal single SQL VM that you're deploying. As I mentioned, if any of these settings that you make here, they're going to go across all of the VMs that you're deploying. So I'm just going to leave it as default because this is just a demo. But if you wanted to go through and you wanted to change it, if you're deploying 9 VMs, all 9 VMs are going to get the exact same settings across. So everything will stay the same there. SQL Server settings. So this again is where we've made a significant change to how the layout goes and how your deployment goes, because you've got to add your availability group. So I'm going to give it an availability group name. I'm going to give it a listener name. They're really fancy names, I know, but you give each one of those names. Additionally, what we have here is you can assign each role to the VM. So if I have 9 VMs, I can go ahead and I can assign my single primary as well as secondary. Whether or not I want automatic failover on any of the nodes, if I want sync commit, and whether or not I want it to be a readable secondary. We tried to make it as easy as possible in a single deployment so that you don't have to go back in and make changes once you've set up your availability group. You can select your, security and networking for SQL, whether or not you want SQL auth, Key Vault, and then here's your SQL instance settings. Again, this is the exact same that we have for a single VM, single SQL VM. So you come through, you can make changes to, whether or not you want to optimize for ad hoc workload or any of the settings that you want. You want to change max stop, feel free here, and it's going to go across all of them. This deployment experience, one thing that I do want to mention is when you're deploying, all of the settings that we've selected for your availability group and failover cluster, they follow all of our best practices that we have for using an AG within Azure VM. Because some of the settings, because of the latency that you have in Azure, you have to make some changes to some of the settings. So all of the settings that we have and underlying configurations, they're all based off of the best practices that we have out there. And they're implemented when you go through and you do this deployment experience. So next, obviously, is tags. Use it if you want it. Don't use it if you don't use it in your organization. But this tab right here, when you're going through the workflow, is the biggest change that we have to this. So this is the prerequisite validation request. So we're asking you to download this prerequisites check script. It's a PowerShell script that is, this link only becomes available to you once you've basically filled out everything else on the previous tabs, because we're pulling that information out, like your VM names, your account names, your domain name, the cluster name, AG name, all of that stuff. We're pulling it out of what you've entered in here. And we ask that you run it on your domain controller VM. If you run it on the domain controller VM, it's going to tell you whether or not this is good to go. And once you know that it's good to go, you can go ahead and you can, initiate your deployment. And we know that we're pretty certain that it shouldn't fail for you at that particular moment, because early on in the public preview, what we noticed is a lot of people don't have the permissions correct. They're using an account that maybe is there, or they're using a VM name that already exists. So you are able to reuse names, but you have to make sure that those objects are not in use at the particular moment that you're attempting to do the deployment, because just like any deployment, you can't have two machines with the same name. It's going to fail. Once you've gone through and you've downloaded the prerequisites check, you run it. Obviously, I'm not going to run it for this. And then just click the little confirmation that you've done it. You go through and review and create. This goes through and it gives you an overview of, what it is that you're deploying. It's the standard deployment. The thing that we do have here is you can download the template for automation, because obviously a lot of customers will want to just automate this however they normally automate any of their deployment experiences or deployments. So we do generate a template with all of the information that you would need in order to set up this as like basically your failover cluster, your AG, your listener, everything like that will be in that template for you to deploy. I'm not going to go ahead and click a deployment on this because, as I mentioned, it does take some time. I'm only deploying 3 VMs, but it will probably take 30 minutes or so to deploy even the 3 VMs. So we'll just go ahead and we'll pretend that it worked. If it works, you obviously will have within your resource group, you're going to wind up with all of your VMs that you've deployed, all the objects, all the infrastructure that you need for this. This is one of the VMs that I have previously deployed. And if you come into the SQL virtual machine, not the virtual machine, because as you know, the SQL virtual machine has a separate entry in the portal. And I come to high availability. We also have what is a read-only. It's a read-only portal that kind of gives you some information as to what the health is of your availability group. So once you go through the deployment experience, since we don't set up a database for you, that's on you. We're not touching databases. We're just doing the underlying infrastructure for you. Everything should be in place for you once the deployment is done. You just have to go in and you have to add a database to your availability group. If this was a fresh deployment, this this dashboard here is going to basically tell me I have to add a database in order to get the health of my availability group, because it's going to show that it's going to show it's there, but it's going to show unhealthy because there's no databases. But this shows you that I've got two SQL servers that I have in my AG. They're both async commit with manual failover. So yeah, so that's pretty much our deployment experience that we have. For this, let me go ahead and let me stop sharing this. Do we have any questions? Maybe not. Okay, let's see. All right, so there's the AG Health in the portal. And yeah, so that's pretty much all that I've got. That's the extent of the deployment experience. Do anybody have any questions? I know this was not a full hour. I tried to extend it out. I did warn everybody that this was a 20-minute presentation. So but if there's any questions, I would be happy to try and answer any of your questions that you have. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about how this works or anything. So
I know, definitely great presentation. So, Taryn, when you have like there are a couple of zone regions like Switzerland region. So, and then that latest Gen 2 VM, for example, that EBTSP5 with NVMe enabled with PSSD disk. So there are a lot of limitations with those regions when it comes to with availability set or availability zone. How so do we have any one single, like how do you like, is there any plan to handle that in those smaller regions? Because like I work in like 17 regions with like
sure.
across the globe.
So the deployment experience should be available in every region. There are, as you mentioned, there are limitations in some regions. So you should be able to go through and deploy it. You may not have all of the options necessarily in order to set this up, but it should work across every single region.
Mhm. Okay. We do have one question. We recommend synchronous or asynchronous between VM. You recommend. So what? That's a question. Like, what do you recommend?
It's up to you. So it depends on what your workload is. From my experience, when I was a production DBA, we used async commit, but that was because we didn't need to use sync commit. When you use sync commit, you do also have some additional latency and not latency, but your readable secondaries may not be available right away as you're waiting for things to harden. So it really depends on what it is that you're doing. So for me, as I mentioned, when I was a production DBA, we used async commit because we were very heavy on our readable secondaries and we didn't want to wait. So, and we were not, I worked at Stack Overflow. We were not a bank. So if somebody read dirty data, we didn't obviously care because it was, it's Stack Overflow. But if you're working in a bank, you're using a readable secondary, you probably want to make sure that they are using not dirty data. And so you probably want to stick with sync commit. It really depends on your workflow and what your workload and what it is that you need. So my suggestion is do some research and do some testing to see what works for you. When you if you set up an AG and you were going across regions, so let's say you had a primary in East US and you had a secondary in West US, you probably would want to use async commit because you've got that latency that's there and you're going to be impacted by writing those logs from east to west. But again, caveat is it's up to you. It's up to whatever your needs are. So you have to know whatever your workload is and what you're using each of your secondaries for. Any other questions? I tried. I did. I warned you. I tried to stretch it out.
Maybe you could have played it at in the old record terminology at 33
Slow it
RPM as
down.
against
Yeah.
78 RPM. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I
But
tried.
this is
I really did. I
this is
tried to stretch it
great.
out. This was a very short presentation when we gave it at PASS. So I tried to do it.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, Survi, can you